Good evening, everybody. Welcome to What Lola Heard, Theatrical Sounds of Climate Change. This event is brought to you by the Living Room Theatre and the Sydney Environment Institute from the University of Sydney. My name is Leanne Logue. I'm an artist working with the Living Room Theatre Company. I'm also a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Architecture, Design and Planning here at the university. So first I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay respects to their elders past and present. In the spirit of paying respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country, we can view this event tonight as part of a continuous tradition of music and voice that energizes knowledge and culture in unique ways. What Lola Heard, Theatrical Sounds and Climate Change, is a fascinating insight into the creative process in contemporary theatre. You might be wondering, what does climate change sound like? What is a theatrical sound as opposed to some other kind of sound? And who is Lola? So all these questions will be answered in due course. I'm certainly curious as to what we will receive tonight about them through various modes of performance. As with all of the Living Room Theatre works, they are hard to pigeonhole and defy categorization. Part public talk, part installation, and part concert, the evening brings together internationally acclaimed improvising musicians in conversation with David Roesner, Professor of Theatre Studies from LMU Munich, and Michelle Sanan, the Artistic Director of the Living Room Theatre Company. An impressive cast. Michelle has created a body of work to interpret research conducted at the Sydney Environment Institute for a new audience. This is part of a knowledge translation process project that's going on, looking at new ways of articulating academic and research knowledge. So intrigued by the public lecture, Michelle takes this idea and reimagines it as a conversation with David Roesner, where they will discuss the exciting new genre of composed theatre, which takes place at the intersection of music and theatre. David is Professor for Theatre and Music Theatre at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He is here to collaborate with Michelle as a dramaturg on the creative development of a new theatre work to be performed in March this year called Lola Stayed Too Long. There goes Lola again. The conversation will be facilitated by Dr. Killian Quigley. Killian is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Sydney Environment Institute, recently arrived from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Yeah. The musicians gracing us tonight are well known for their experimental and interdisciplinary approaches to composition and improvised performance. We have Alistair Spence on prepared piano and samples. Mary Rapp on cello, double bass and voice. And last but not least, Alexandra Spence on field recordings, tapes and amplified objects. Now, you may be wondering how the night will unfold here in the Sound Lounge. It's not, as with Living Room Theatre, it's expect the unexpected. The musicians will perform compositions from the Living Room Theatre's environmental works, where you'll be drawn into an environment of the ear and taken on an auditory journey. The first set will be led by Alexandra Spence, and will be playing some of the musical works she's been devising for Lola Stayed Too Long, the upcoming performance work. This will be followed by a conversation between Michelle Sanan and David Roesner, facilitated by Killian Quigley, and there will be opportunity for the audience to ask questions, and at that stage you can come and see me at the microphone. We'll then take a short break between sets. The bar will be open, and in fact is open during the whole evening, so please, if you feel like getting a little bit thirsty as the evening unfolds, you can quietly go over and get a drink, or you can wait till the break as well. The second set is a collective improvisation led by Mary Rapp. It uses samples from Lawrence English's Soundscape, which was written for another of the Living Room Theatre's environmental works called Black Crows Invaded Our Country. So enough from me. Just ask you to please relax and enjoy the sounds of What Lola Heard.
effectively deal with my own issues. So I think, like a lot of people in the situation, you become more isolated. So that was my experience.
I believe in climate change. I believe that that's happening, and it's just the impact on myself personally is one of, I become very agitated. My body blows up, as in feet and hands. I find it very difficult to cope. My cognitive thinking goes off to the point where I can be, I can't think straight. The heat is just so bad. And sometimes I feel like I'm just breathing in hot air. I don't like having hot food, so I live on salads and ice cream and that sort of stuff. But I have found ways to cope to a degree. Do you want to hear those? So what I do is I get a wet hand towel and I run it under cold water and I put it around my neck and I leave it there until it needs to be done again. I get a spray bottle with ice water in it and just spray it on my face, and I do that to the cat as well.
I suppose some of the major impacts for me it was because I suffer from depression and the heat. Basically, you're baking. And I have autism at times, issues, social anxiety issues and things. And so you think, how do you escape the heat? You go to the shopping centre where there are loads of people, whereas you absolutely hate crowds. So it's kind of like going from one form of hell to another. And so that was a big issue for me. It was the fact that if I wanted to escape the heat, I had to go where there were heaps of people, and that would cause me further anxiety and issues. And half the time it was still hot because that many people, the air conditioning units in shopping centres, they can only do so much. So for me, a lot of it was like playing on my own mental health issues. So I'm like, okay, I can be alone and bake, or I can go into a crowd of people and bake and want to kill them. So the impacts for me were like,
50,000 people descending on Penrith Plaza and not spending a cent. So our policymakers need to get out of Macquarie Street or get out of wherever their air-conditioned offices and not just do a publicity photo shoot at Penrith Pool and jump back into the air-conditioned limo. Come out here and spend a summer out here, 2 or 3 weeks in a heat wave, rent a house without air conditioning yet. The quickest way to change someone's mind is to make them experience it, have a lived experience.
I found Wentworth is, with older residents, elderly residents, they will give them a phone call once or twice a week, because we have had residents that have passed, and when your rent just gets taken out automatically and you don't really know your neighbors. We haven't seen old Joe for a few weeks. What's that funny smell? That's happened. Yeah. It's kind of like there's a bit of a smell coming from Joe's place. Let's go check on Joe. Well, Joe had moved on with him last month, so there's not a lot of social interaction at times.
I stayed alone and baked, which was not healthy for me because I was becoming more socially isolated, even though it was a bit of an issue for me. I went and bought myself a little water cooler and basically sat in front of that. It wasn't effective. I wasn't able to effectively deal with my own issues. So I think, like a lot of people in the situation, you become more isolated. So that was my experience.
I believe in climate change. I believe that that's happening, and it's just the impact on myself personally is one of, I become very agitated. My
That's
body
the other
blows
thing
up
I've done to try and
as
cut
if
down the
feet
heat.
and hands.
I've planted trees.
I find it very
I've
difficult.
got 5 trees that are 2.5
My
meters high.
cognitive thinking goes off
I'm about to
the point
plant
where I
another
can
one. I should have done it when I
can't
first went
think
there,
straight.
but there was absolutely
The heat is
nothing,
just so bad.
and it took me 3 years to establish the
Sometimes I feel
gardens
like I'm just
and put the
breathing
trees
hot
in.
air.
Native trees to
I
attract
don't
the
like having hot
birds,
food,
but
so
also
I
to
live
try
on
and cut the
salads
heat
and ice
out.
cream, that sort of stuff.
It's not actually working.
But I have found ways
You
to
wake up
cope
in the
to it.
morning and you're faced with trees.
Do you want to hear those?
There is a lot of trees around the area,
So what I do is
which
I
I
get a
think
wet
might help a
hand
wee bit.
towel and I run it under cold
but then
water,
again, my
and I put
barometer
it around
says
my neck
it's
and I
45
leave it there
degrees.
until it needs to
I
be done
remember
again.
being in 48 degrees there once.
I get a spray bottle
48
with ice
degrees.
water in it and just spray it on my face, and I do that to the cat as well.
I suppose some of the major
I stayed
impacts
alone
for
and baked, which
for
was
me
not
it was
healthy for
because
me
I suffer
I
from
was
depression and the
becoming
heat.
more socially
Basically,
isolated,
you're baking.
even though it was a bit
And I have
of an issue.
autism at times, issues,
bought
social
myself
anxiety
a
issues and things.
basically
And so you
sat
think,
in front
how do you
of that.
escape
It
the
wasn't
heat?
effective.
You go to the shopping centre where there are loads of people, whereas you absolutely hate crowds. So it's kind of like going from one form of hell to another. And so that was a big issue for me. It was the fact that if I wanted to escape the heat, I had to go where there were heaps of people, and that would cause me further anxiety and issues.
Direction, having read my work. I'm not talking about denial as in the climate skeptic movement. I want to use on Stanley Cohen, who's a British sociologist, has different typologies of denial. And so there's literal denial, which is that climate change is not occurring. There's another form of denial that I think is very relevant for what I will talk about, although it's not the main thing, and that is interpretive denial. It's not what you think it is. Yes, that did happen, but da-da-da-da-da. And I think, well, I'll come back to that towards the end. And are you able to, an implicatory denial. And this is the part which is more what we think of as the idea of an elephant in the room. So I talk about and use the term denial in my work. Folks on the right in the United States have assumed and taken this in another direction, having read my work. I'm not talking about denial as in the climate skeptic movement. I want to use on Stanley Cohen, who's a British sociologist, has different typologies of denial. And so there's literal denial, which is that climate change is not occurring. There's another form of denial that I think is very relevant.
I should have done it when I first went there, but there was absolutely nothing, and it took me 3 years to establish the
jump
guy.
back into the air-conditioned limo. Come out here and spend a summer out here. 2 or 3 weeks in a heat wave. Rent a house without air conditioning, yeah. The quickest way to change someone's mind is to make them experience it. Have a lived experience. You know, 40, 50,000
I
people
think might help alleviate.
plaza.
But then again, my barometer says it's 45 degrees. I remember being in 48 degrees there once. 48 degrees. I'm a very private person. In fact, I'm quite pedantic about it.
2 or 3 weeks in a heat wave. Rent a house without air conditioning, yeah. The quickest way to change someone's mind is to make them experience it. Have a lived experience. You know, 40, 50,000 myself a little water cooler. Basically sat in front of that. It wasn't effective.
I'm about to
I wasn't
play.
able to effectively deal with my own
I should have done it when I first went
So I
there.
think, like a lot of people,
There was absolutely nothing, and it took me 3 years to establish the guidelines
who's a
and
British
put the trees
sociologist,
in.
has different
Native trees to attract
typologies
birds,
I
of
believe in
denial.
climate
but
change.
also
And
to
so
try
there's
and
literal
I believe
denial,
that's
which is
happening,
that climate
and
change
It's
is
not actually working.
myself.
There's
Wake up
another
in the
form of
morning,
denial
face
that I think is very relevant for what I will
There
talk
is a lot of
about
trees around the area,
and that is
which I think might help
interpretive
alleviate.
denial.
But then again,
Not what you
my
think
barometer
it is.
says
Yes,
it's
that did
45
happen,
degrees.
but
I remember being in 48 degrees there. 48 degrees.
I can't think straight.
And are you able to
The heat is
see
just
an
so bad.
implicatory denial?
sometimes I feel like I'm just breathing.
Stayed alone in pain, just not
is more
healthy for me.
what
I don't
we
like
think
having
of
to
as
That's why I
the
make it
idea of
sound.
an elephant
Even though it was a bit of an issue.
So I
went
talk
to-
about and use the term denial in my
Basically
work
sat in front of
to
that.
folks
It
on
wasn't
the right in the United
what I
States
do is I get a red
another
pen.
direction who haven't read
So
my
I
work.
think like a lot of
I'm not talking about denial as in the climate skeptic movement.
that was
I've
Spray bottle.
used on Stanley Cohen, who's a
I
British
found one where
sociologist,
this
who has different
older residents.
typologies of denial.
Some of the major impacts.
And so there's literal denial, which is climate change is not occurring. There's another form of denial that I think is very relevant for what I will talk about, although it's not the main thing, and that is interpretive denial. It's not what you think it is. Yes, that did happen, but da 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 da. And I think
Testing. Elephant. 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 Elephant friends, hello. Hello. Welcome. My name is Kellyanne Quigley. Michelle St. Anne, you are the founder and artistic director of Living Room Theatre and the deputy director of the Sydney Environment Institute. I work there as well, but I'm not as important as you, so you may not have noticed me before. David Roesner, you're professor of theatre science at Ludwig Maximilian Universität München. Welcome, welcome. We need to talk, you two. I don't really know where to begin with this piece that we just heard. I'm feeling kind of scrambled by it. I'm feeling quite uncomfortable in a way that I'm liking. But that I'm not quite able to put into words. For you, Michelle, this is, what we've just heard is actually part of a greater whole. Is that right? Can you
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that greater whole and what you're working on?
Okay, so this what you just heard are samples from the work that Alexandra is composing for a project I'm working on, Lola Stay Too Long, which is about heat waves, the experience of heat waves in the suburbs and its catastrophic effects on the elderly, all the big stuff. And what you've heard here is some of those, the data that's come back from a study in Penrith that my colleagues at the Institute have been doing. And we've had my colleagues from the office actually, I've recorded them saying those language because we've got to, of course, not give too much away of the identity of the residents. So that's really what you're hearing is the two other musicians improvising off those samples and Alexandra's ideas. So what you will have found that was missing is my part, the theatre part, the pictures and the story.
And tell us a bit about, in a more general sense, the role that music plays in your theatrical practice.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about music? How are you working with music, working through music, and so on?
Okay, so I have two main ways of working. One is actually the way it helps me create the rhythm of the work. So where I take the inspiration from, I actually write from music. So music, music gives me images as opposed to the other way around, where image, you then put the music on top of that. I work the other way around. So music's actually very visual for me. So that's kind of what that's how I work. And then on the other side of that, it's not only the music making the work, I then have to fine tune it and loop it around and allow it to sit in the images and the space that I work, because I don't work in theatre spaces, I work in corridors and doorways and dissection labs. And so I then have to work out how it sounds and feels and manifests in space.
And give us a little flavor of what that means in real time, as it were. I mean, if you're working with a composer like Alex or whomever else, are you presenting them with a series of thoughts to which they respond, or vice versa, or is it a lot of sort of going back and forth? I mean, get us into that space a little bit.
Basically, I stalk whoever I want to compose for me.
Oh, good. That's good.
And then I vomit all over them with ideas.
Oh, good. That's very good.
I want, and then I think, and then I want, and then they look at me. And then they go away, and they usually give me something, some sort of scratches of their ideas, and see how it sort of sits with us. With Alex, I stalked her, and then I did vomit all over her, and then 2 days later, she provided me with 9 minutes of a piece of music that I went, oh my God, she's walked inside my head and she's just put this to sound, which, I've paid a lot of people to do that, and they haven't been able to do that, and I just had to speak to a musician. And so from that, she has a lot of space, and Alistair's the same, Mary's the same, where they leave the tentacles out for where my practice comes and they can hook on, and then we go on a journey together. And there's fighting and there's all of that kind of thing going on, but that's how collaborations work.
That's great, thanks. So, especially like the bit about the vomiting. So, David's here. Well, we're not quite ready for you yet, David. But I'll deal with you in just a moment. Michelle, why is David here? My sense is that
I stalked him. So I was feeling empty and alone making the kind of work that I do in Sydney. And my beautiful husband found this book, tiny book about that big, about that fat, in Kinokuniya, and said, these are your people, you should read that. And I said, that's $80. I can't pay that.
David.
He's expensive, this dude. And then I made another work, and then I was feeling even more lonely and more pathetic. And so I went back and I bought the book, and I read it. And he thinks I'm the only person that read it, but David McGarity, I think, read it. And I cried because I realised he articulated my practice, he articulated my sensitivity, and I realised that there's a bunch of middle-aged white guys in Europe who are me. I'm one of them. And that is such a fantastic and empowering feeling. Boom! And then, so then this project came up. My boss was working on this beautiful project about heat waves, and of course you can't see heat waves, and she doesn't look fantastic on television, so there's no great tweeting and what have you around heat waves. She's silent, and of course that's how I feel, and I think, I talk a lot, but I love the idea that I could give her a voice, and so I've named her Lola. And by naming her, she exists. And we received some money from Shark. I can't ever remember what it stands for. And I was able to bring out the beautiful David Roesner. Sorry, I'm excited.
David. Yes. What was the name of that book, by the way?
Oh, the book. It's only $79.99. No. It's a book we put together in 2012. It's called, when I say we, it's important to acknowledge my co-editor, Matthias Rebstock. and it was called, it's still called Composed Theatre. Shall I talk a little bit about
yeah,
what that
tell
book
us
is
what
about?
that means.
So essentially, Matthias and I felt in conversation that we had a sense that there was something out there, a field of work, a series of performances and a number of practices that belonged together, that had some connection, and that connection was difficult to pinpoint because they were not really a genre, they were not really sort of a cohesive aesthetic that you could pinpoint and say, oh, when they do that, we call it composed theatre. But instead, we felt it's something that has to do with the actual process of making them. There's something that they share, which is a kind of a compositional approach, a compositional way of thinking in making theatre. In other words, all of these practitioners, not all of them were white men, but usually, a predominance of them, looked at the theatre almost as something that one could compose within its entirety. So it's not about rehearsing a scene with dialogue and actors, and that's wonderful, and then you add some music to it. So I learned this new word today, because I still struggle with what to call this kind of music that we heard earlier, the kind of music that's designed, composed, made for theatre. And I tend to call it theatre music, which is not very inventive, but anyway. But there's another word out there which is called soundtrack music, and that's sort of that actually plays into that idea. It's literally a separate track. It comes from film, of course. The idea of you shoot the film is ready, and then you chuck some music on it, and that can be better or worse. But it's a separate, segregated kind of thing. And here, what we find is a much more, and in composed theatre in general, a much more integrated process where the ideas of rhythm or sound or timbre or form or structure extend throughout the work and shape the words, the gestures, the images, the spaces, etc., etc.
Okay, so when we talk about composition, we're talking about musical composition or quasi-musical composition, styles of composition coming from music. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's another thing we learned, because I'm German, so for us Komposition is practically always associated with music, and I learned that in English, composition can be chemicals together that make a plastic or something like that. So we had to kind of say, no, what we're talking about is musical composition, but in that extended sense that you can also compose lights, or you can compose, you can sort of apply compositional thinking to other things. And of course there are historical pioneers such as John Cage or other people who've explored those ideas, that composition can extend to things other than traditional instruments or sounds. It can extend to noises. It can extend to sounds in general. But also it can even extend to visual things. You could even compose smells, but maybe we're not going there yet.
Oh.
Yeah. See.
Say that into the microphone.
We've got blood and bone in the next work because it smells like death.
Isn't that nice?
Unfortunately, that's from our personal experience. So.
You keep the microphone for a second there, Michelle. Thanks, David. That was really good. So Michelle, give us a sense of, for you, like, you've told us a bit about what about composed theatre resonates so powerfully with your work, or the ways in which your work intersects with it. How is that different for you from what we might think of as conventional or traditional theatre? How is this represent a departure from, if it's fair to say this, the sort of standard way of making theatre?
I guess for me, when I read the book, I realised that there is other ways of making, and there are other ways of receiving work. So that was really important for me, that I thought that I was working in this silo, and look at me, I'm so brilliant. There here comes the light, and it floats across the room, and then it catches the foot of a woman, and then boom, sound comes from a corridor. Well, there's other people doing this stuff, and I was really excited that I was part of a party. I had friends, and in doing that, I was able to allow people to feel. I was able to let them feel vibrations through the body and smell. So, I made a solo work about, it was like an autobiography. So, of course, I grew up in smelling Indian food. So when the audience came in, they would smell Indian food. I made another work based on Tim Winton's book, The Riders, which is about loss of home. So I used to roast a leg of lamb before, because to me leg of lamb smells of home for Australians, and even the vegetarians loved it. So I guess it allows me a holistic way of making work, so people experience theatre in a holistic way.
Thanks very much. Back to David for a sec. Obviously, this is Michelle's work that's engaging us with climate change. Maybe I'll say for me, like activating my senses, my rational brain, my body, to think about climate change in ways that maybe other sorts of things like academic papers or television reports or what have you don't. What's your impression of the relationship between composed theatre and maybe climate change in particular, or perhaps more generally, efforts to sort of connect people with pressing concerns in their immediate locales or in the world at large?
Well, that's a tricky one. I think, I guess what composed theatre, what it is characterized by, I think in general, is an experimental outlook. It's a kind of theatre that takes nothing for granted to begin with. So it doesn't say, oh, it's got to have 3 acts, it's going to have 2 main characters, and they've got to fall in love at some point, and then there's going to be a... And I'm not saying that we don't still need those kind of stories, and they're not sort of, fine, and we all crave them. But this is something that composed theatre departs from and renegotiates the way in which the things we see connect with each other. Maybe we have to do quite a bit of work of that connecting. Maybe they're just put next to each other and we'll connect the dots. So I think it activates a different kind of spectatorship, a different kind of engagement. And it also allows for big... we talked about this the other day, and the word that came up a couple of times was destabilizing. That sounds a bit negative, but it can be quite a good thing. If you're a stable genius at that, then obviously you don't want... Ooh, it's getting political. Then you don't want new things to come into your mind, obviously, seriously. But if you're sort of slightly, reeling from jet lag or whatever, then you make different kinds of experiences, and it leaves different impressions on you. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it can be a space where things can be talked about and experienced in different ways, but in essential ways. So it's in terms of the knowledge it produces or transfers. We have that word as well, knowledge transfer. It's not your conventional narrative that makes sense, that has a beginning and an end, because what we experience it does not have a beginning of an end. It's not a neat story. It's a very complex issue, and we can only begin to engage with it by in some ways exposing us to experiences like the kind of theatre where we may walk out with a lot more questions than answers.
Yeah, that's good, right? I love this idea that by kind of disorganizing one's experience of art, and by disorganizing one's sensorium even, right, that one can actually become more receptive to certain kinds of feelings, certain kinds of experiences, maybe certain kinds of knowledge. There's a phrase that came up just at the beginning of our event tonight, knowledge translation. This is something that you and I have been talking about a bit, Michelle. What do you make of knowledge translation? I mean, is this something that you feel like you're doing when you're making theatre, or does this feel like a sort of, I don't know, maybe a crude way of describing what it is that we're doing here? What do you make of knowledge translation?
Okay, so there's so many examples of knowledge translation. I think the main thing that everyone's funding at the moment is the translation of science into art, and we've got the Vivid Festival that puts science up in garish lights on buildings, and we think that that's translation. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that scientist was trying to say, and I'm really scared of what the artist is trying to say. I look at that and I go, I don't know what I'm supposed to feel or think. And I guess when I started this project, I was really scared. I thought, I'm actually going to lose my voice in this, because I actually have to look after what the social scientist wants to say in this. And then there's the policy makers and all of those. And then so I sort of shook myself and went, no, get a grip. And I read a beautiful article actually given to one of my colleagues about knowledge translation in a Canadian company. And that was when I found it was okay for me to take what was given to me from research and let it live inside me and find my own voice. Well, what do I want to say about this? And that, to me, I found that liberating moment, and I'm terrified because now I've got to make a piece of art, but I'm not terrified that I'm going to lose my voice or that it's not going to be a vehicle for me to communicate. So I hope that the policymakers come and see the work and get a different insight to the data. And I hope that the academics see a new vibration in their research.
Okay, excellent.
Can I add one comment?
Yeah, please.
I think it's a tricky word, translation, because translation suggests you're saying the same thing in a different language. And I think that's not what it is, because I think that would just mean that, you say it again. And I think that kind of gives art a very specific, kind of very functional role of repeating something that's been said in a different kind of language. And I think if it works well, it's not an illustration of the science. It's not just a reiteration with jazz hands and some fancy lights, but it's something that challenges the science as well, challenges the way in which science is expressed. I'm not saying challenges the actual data or something like that, but ask questions. Is that the only way we can express or work through that kind of knowledge? And what is knowledge? In what forms does knowledge exist, etc., etc.? So it's much more profound relationship. And then again, as a theatre scholar, I obviously do the opposite thing as well, where I then look at the artwork and try to not translate it, but again respond to it in some way by trying, to extrapolate, to raise to the questions that it gives me in one way or another. But if I just say, I'll explain this piece to you, that would again be that kind of very literal way of as if you could ever do that and just translate it word by word. Yeah.
Great stuff. Okay, so I think I've got a couple more minutes before we're going to open things up for questions. So I just want to hear a bit about how things have been going these past several days. You've been on the rehearsal floor together. Yeah, let's start with you, David. So what's it been like? You've come over. When did you come over? A week ago?
Thursday night, after a quick trip from Munich. Gosh.
That's right.
Yeah. It's been really fascinating. It's because I haven't been in rehearsal rooms for a little while, and I always find that a very special place, in particular when you don't have a very clear function. I mean, if you're the director or the performer or the composer, you kind of know why you're there and what you're doing. And I was still finding that. I'm still finding that, I guess. But it's fascinating to watch. Very anecdotally, I'll say what I find interesting, because Michel is a quick thinker and an expressive person, and the rehearsal, in contrast, is such a sort of calm pace and such a sort of quiet atmosphere in many ways, and really takes its time to explore. And I'm a quick, as you can tell, quick sort of talker and impatient and so forth. And I found that quite, with jet lag added, it was quite an experience to kind of, sit there, see someone rap sort of something around the head for about 15 minutes or so, and then do it again, and then do it again. But on a more serious note, I found it really interesting to see how every element, text, sound snippets, music, space, light, action, they all are rehearsed at the same time, which is very unusual in terms of, usually in theatre you've got a clear chronology. You first work with the text, with the actors, and at some point they get costumes, and at some point you add, the light, etc., etc. And really that kind of very integral thinking of that all has to do with each other, and it all has to bounce off each other. That's very, very exciting to watch. The difficult part, and then I'll stop, was to keep trying to sort of to imagine what this piece that you're rehearsing in a studio space will actually look like in the physical spaces that I didn't know. And we traveled through them yesterday or the day before yesterday. And then it kind of, there was a lot of, oh, this is where that's happening, and that's where the light is coming from. Oh, that makes a lot of sense now. So, yeah, that was fascinating.
Thank you. So, Michelle, some of us who know you are still trying to wrap our heads around this idea that you're kind of slow and really, I don't know, relaxed and taking it easy. But
It's
I
the
guess
Killian way.
we'll take, I don't know. We'll take David's word for it. What's it been like having David here in Sydney, working with you?
It's really scary. Yeah, I was really intimidated that I actually opened the day with, we're all sitting around the table and we have to do the, who are you? This is what I do. And then I just sort of just come out with it. I said, I am terrified because this guy is just sitting opposite me and he's going to be watching me, and I don't really have that. And often, I'd go on a riff on the rehearsal floor in my fast moments, and then I'd forget that David was actually in the room, and then go, oh, I've got someone to ask an opinion about, which was, once I got used to that idea of having someone to actually tease ideas out from a point of view of not knowing anything about the project, which I think is really exciting place to be, I sort of relaxed into it, and now I feel like he's like my left hand or right hand. It's really quite a fantastic experience. But it was terrifying at first. We all want to be fabulous, don't we? And then, ba-bum.
Oh, well, thanks. How about questions from the audience? I'll admit that I'm sort of blinded by this light, but if anyone would like to ask something,
I think Leanne's got a mic. Oh, there's movement.
Oh, great. Is it question asking movement, I wonder?
1, 2, 3, 4,
Leanne's got the mic.
5, 6.
Who'd like to inquire?
Don't be intimidated
No.
by the microphone.
I think we can probably hear you, can't we?
I'm going to try to make this sound intelligent, but I was thinking when you were describing the type of composed theater and the way sound plays into it, how obviously you wouldn't call it musical theater, but in a way, if you didn't know what musical theater was, you could call it musical theater. And how would you intelligently say what the difference is between those two?
That's a good question.
I'm scared. I have to say this intelligently. This is not no. That's a completely valid question, because the boundaries between, this is the tricky thing why we keep saying it's about a process and it's not so much about a genre. The type of work we looked at in its outcome, in what it is at the end, could be quite a number of things. You could have composed theatre where there's not a single note of music, and you could have composed theatre that is barely distinguishable from musical theatre or opera or music theatre or something like that. It's more the process that we're interested in. And of course, in musical theatre, in the more traditional sense, you have a very chronological and very separated kind of a process where someone writes a libretto, someone sets that to music, someone else directs that, or then someone else produces it, etc., etc. Whether or not these things become actually integrated and mutually influential depends very much on the individual creative team. But you could, if you want to be a bit facetious, you could say there is musical theatre that is not very musical, in that sort of sense of it being really integrated, where you know, the lyrics really play with, perhaps with the sound, where the choreography is not just a duplication of the already, you know, existing music, etc., etc. So that's kind of where we looked at this notion of transference, or you know, where sounds become maybe gesture, and gesture become rhythm, and light become, you know, that kind of thing, where those boundaries are worked with and worked upon. More generally speaking, the kind of practices we're looking at have that kind of experimental drive. Most of them really want to find out something new, want to sort of tease out a new image, a new sound, a new something, which some musical theatre does, but more often than not. And I'm not bashing musical theatre. It's good, but it's more often about very cleverly and often in a very crafted way playing with tropes that have been there before and rehashing that. And I'm not judging it. I'm just saying it plays to a different kind of, or it has a different aim. Let's put it that way. Hope that makes sense. Made sense.
Other questions? You've been so lucid in your, accounts of yourselves and of one another. May I ask, Michelle, what's it been like tonight hearing Alex's composition?
I'm really excited because we've actually recorded it. So, Alex, I've got some good bookmarks for you. And it's really exciting for me to hear music in a different context, because that actually then informs the context that you're working in. So that's hopefully you're enjoying it as well. Can I just say a quick thank you to Hannah Della Bosca, who is actually the research assistant on the project, and she's just had to do a lot of work on it, and I'm like taking it. So I just want to say that thank you so much for your hard work, Hannah.
Hear, hear. What do you think, Leon?
What do you think, Gillian?
I don't know.
I think we need to have
My
a
wine
drill.
is empty.
About right, isn't it? Yeah.
Not before I add
Sorry.
my thanks. Sorry, I just want to say thank you to Michelle and also to the Institute and to David and to everyone who made it possible for me to come. I think it's tremendously exciting and I feel very privileged to be here. So thank you, and thank you all for coming as well, and the musicians and everyone. Thanks very, very much.
Don't worry, we're only halfway through. There's more. But first, we're going to take a break. I would like to thank, though, the really wonderful conversation led by Killian Quigley with Professor David Roesner and Michelle St. Anne. So thank you for sharing really some quite intimate stories and responses to each other there as well. What Lola heard. Before we commence Act 2 or Set 2, we're going to play a little game. This is in the tradition of the Living Room Theatre. We're going to play Pass the Parcel. Woo! And we're going to start with the parcel being held by David Roesner. Where is David? So everyone knows how to play Pass the Parcel, right? So you know when the music starts, you have to pass the parcel. It's very simple. And when the music stops, whoever is lucky enough to be holding the parcel unwraps one layer. Shall we begin? Yeah, when the music starts. And you've won a white envelope. Congratulations. What's your name? Maria. Maria is the winner of the white envelope.
Yay!
Well done. And now for some music.
We are
I feel like we touched the sublime just then. That was extraordinary. Thank you so much. We are in really extraordinary company tonight. I'd like to thank the musicians, Mary Rapp, Alexandra Spence, and Elsa Spence for these beautiful compositions they share with us. And on the other side of the room, to Michelle Sinan, David Roesner, and Killian Quigley. For very illuminating and revealing conversations. So I think we're just at the beginning of something here with this whole exploration that Michelle is undertaking. And if you're interested, I certainly want to see more, hear more, feel more. And I think the next work that's coming up is... Lola Stay Too Long, which is not far off in March. So if you're liking what you're hearing and feeling, please do come along to more. If you're not already on the mailing list, please do sign up. I'd just like to conclude the evening by thanking everyone for coming along tonight and being a really beautiful audience. The Living Room Theatre Company, Sydney Environment Institute, and the Seymour Centre for making this happen. So thank you, everyone.